evening, everybody. We're going to start. Welcome to OISE. My name is Tara Goldstein, and I'm going to be one of the first people who welcome you to OISE and to this amazing event with our good friend and colleague, Patti Lather. The first person who wants to welcome you all to OISE is Claire Brett, our Interim Academic Director of Graduate Studies. Help me welcome Claire.
Well, thank you, Tara, because I can't remember this title. All the titles at OISE are horribly long. Well, we are indeed really fortunate, and I'm so happy to be able to welcome Patti today. She joins us from the Ohio State University, where she's professor in the School of Educational Policy and Leadership. She is a world-renowned and highly influential scholar, as many of you know, who has brought feminist and post-structuralist theories to bear on qualitative research methodology. She has reconsidered the criteria for evaluating qualitative research, has linked research to social justice, and is regularly referenced in critical studies of education and the human sciences. And we had a lovely session this afternoon, and you'll have an even more wonderful one this evening, hearing all of her ideas. So thank you very much, Patti, for joining us.
So I'm here to talk a little bit about a new organization called CQERC. CQERC is a new organization, a new community at OISE, which stands for the Critical Qualitative Education Research Community. Patti is here on a 2-day visit to help us put together a great beginning for this new group. It's going to compose of faculty and graduate students and undergraduate students and initial teacher education students, all who are interested in critical approaches to qualitative research and want to bring those perspectives and those paradigms to bear on their research. We have some wonderful colleagues from the Center of Critical Qualitative Research in Health work, and we were very inspired by the work that you did, the community that you've put together, and we are going to follow suit. An event like this doesn't happen with a lot of support, so I'm going to just take a few minutes to thank all of our sponsors. And if you're here and you can wave, that would be great, because then we'll be able to acknowledge you. So we have to thank the OISE Dean's Office, the OISE Alumni Association, the OISE Visiting Scholars Program, the OISE Associate Dean of Research, the OISE Academic Directors, and Claire is one of them. We want to also thank all of our departments at OISE, the Department of Applied Psychology and Human Development, the Department of Curriculum Teaching and Learning, the Department of, wait for it, Humanities, Social Science, and Social Justice Education. We're new, we're still playing with those words. Another new department, the Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Education, the OISE School University Partnership Office, who helped us organize the reception and has all these wonderful tablecloths. That gives us just that little bit of class and glamour. We want to thank the Faculty of Social Work. I hope some of our social work colleagues are here. We want to thank the Women and Gender Studies Institute. We hope that some of you are here. And finally, we want to thank the Center for Critical Qualitative Health Research, and I know you're here. We're all very excited. I know there are several OISE classes who have come en masse as a group and a community to spend some time. Welcome, and I think you're going to have one of your most wonderful classes of the semester. I see there are already folks sitting on the floor. Welcome to the tradition. Every single AER conference I've ever been at, I've sat on the floor in order to hear Professor Patti Lather. So now you are part of a new generation that is doing it here at OISE. It wouldn't be a Patti Lather event if there weren't folks on the floor. There are some chairs up in front, and I think that you'd be welcome to take them. And one next to Heather Sykes. And if there's a chair near you, if you can just point, feel free to come on up, but also feel free to be in tradition and sit on the floor. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn the podium over to my colleague, Roland, because Roland is going to give a very special introduction to Patti. Please welcome Roland.
Good evening. My name is Roland Sintos Colom. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Humanities, Social Sciences, and Social Justice Education, and I'm the co-organizer of CQERC with Tara Goldstein. It is with honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Patti Lather. Patti has taught qualitative research, feminist methodology, and gender and education at The Ohio State University since 1988. She is the author of 4 books, Getting Smart, Feminist Research and Pedagogy Within the Postmodern in 1991, Troubling the Angels, Women Living with HIV and AIDS in 1998, Getting Lost, Feminist Efforts Towards a Doubled Science in 2008, and most recently, Engaging Science Policy from the Side of the Messy, 2010. Patti is one who doesn't shy away from intellectual wars, and often at the center of these theory, methods, discussions as an enabling instigator, a fierce critic, and an always engaged interlocutor. Whether these wars and discussions focus on the limits of critical pedagogy, the proliferation of qualitative research paradigms, the questions around rigor, validity, and intellectual legibility, the assertion of openly ideological and theoretical projects, and the emergence of neo-positivism in science policy and educational research, Patti, through her own work, has pushed us to ask different questions and to ask questions differently. She also pushes us to consider the logics and practices of the human sciences and the regimes of truth within which we operate. Frankly, it is difficult to think about qualitative research, especially in education, without Patti Lather. For these reasons, when Tara Goldstein and I conceptualized what we're calling CQERC, we could not think of anyone to inaugurate our initiative other than Patti Lather. OISE has a long tradition and history of qualitative research, from institutional ethnographies and arts-based research to methodological approaches that utilize critical race, feminist, queer, neo-Marxist, psychoanalytic, and post-structuralist perspectives. OISE has a national and global distinction of pursuing research that address crucial sociocultural, economic, political, and historical problems. Many of our faculty members and students are pursuing innovative research ranging from performed ethnography and theoretically informed historiography to linguistic analyses of the state and nationalism and cultural studies of youth, media, and alternative public spheres. CQERC, as Tara mentioned, is an organic initiative that aims to foreground this strong history, tradition, and innovation here at OISE and University of Toronto. We are here to develop intellectual and pedagogical collaborations amongst faculty, students, and the community at large. It is in this spirit that we bring tonight's guest speaker to the University of Toronto. Patti was my dissertation advisor at Ohio State. What I always cherish about my time with her then and now are the ways in which she pushes me to consider my investments, to confront the limits of my own thinking, to remain inquisitive and skeptical, to find fertile ways to be disruptive and interruptive, while holding on to a politic and ethic of difference and social justice. Friends and colleagues, please help me welcome Professor Patti Lather.
Well, for a professor, there's nothing more thrilling than to, my dad always used to say a PhD with a J-O-B. And thank you to you for showing up and taking time out of your busy lives. It hurts me to see you folks way back there. There's a lot of room up here if you want to move up. There's chairs, very comfortable chairs. Why not? I'm going to go on at some length here, so you might as well be comfortable. All right, so thanks to all the folks who worked to get me here. I know Roland did a lot of work because I had a lot of communication with him and there was a lot of paperwork involved, so somebody worked to make all that happen. This talk is Methodology-21, what do we do in the afterward? And you might ask, after what? What post, and neo-posts am I using to situate my remarks on qualitative research in the present moment? What deaths of this and that and returns need to be taken into account? As a sort of shorthand in Getting Lost, which Roland referenced that came out in 2007, I listed the various turns in the social sciences with their attendant citations as, and then here's this long list, linguistic turn, which most of us are familiar with that one, that was sort of the granddaddy of them, linguistic turn, and then structural, critical, deconstructive, rhetorical, cultural, narrative, historical, ethnographic, postmodern, ethical, visual, pragmatic, policy, and theological. And there's books on all of those called, whatever that word was, turn, like the theological turn. And they mean it in the social sciences particularly, but broader as well. And since that 2007 chart, others have emerged, of course, including the material turn, the affective turn, the cross-disciplinary love affair with the neo-pragmatism of the Danish urban planner Bent Flyberg, who you may or may not be familiar with, but my goodness, he's traveled across the disciplines. Holy cow. And I wonder why. What is it about that book, Making Social Science Matter? Yeah, again. He says it doesn't matter, and there's things we can do to make it matter. And I think it's part of what you could call the policy turn. I don't know about your fields, but in education we've had a policy turn, and his book certainly speaks to that. And an increased attention to participatory community-based research, often feminist. As well, there have been many announced deaths, perhaps most famously of the subject, of theory, and quite recently, the university itself. And the returns include the real, the empirical, and one of my favorites, objectivity after deconstruction. Well, think about that. That's my colleague at Ohio State, Stephen Melville, who's a historian of art, has come up with this concept of objectivity after deconstruction. In terms of qualitative research, all of this reframing and emerging and dying generates such terms as positivist qualitative methods, now think about that, and dominant post-positivist or conventional interpretive methodology, and what Fred Erickson calls plain old ethnography. In earlier work, I tried to capture such movement with layerings of 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. And in this schema, 1.0 is the conventional interpretive inquiry that emerged from the liberal humanism of sociology and cultural anthropology, with a fairly untroubled focus on standpoint epistemologies, a humanist subject who has an authentic voice, transparent descriptions of lived experiences, and the generally untroubled belief that better methods and richer descriptions can get us closer to the truth. That's 1.0. Qualitative 2.0 begins to acknowledge multiple realities and voices, messy texts. There's some interesting stuff going on now around this concept of the messiness of the social sciences. Reflexivity, dialogue, empowerment, and so on, but remains within the humanist enclosure, grounded in humanist concepts of language, reality, knowledge, power, truth, resistance, and the subject. The field becomes centered, disciplined, regulated, and normalized as qualitative handbooks. My goodness, I just tried to make a list the other day of all the handbooks. Textbooks and journals create moments and designs and fix the research process so that it becomes possible to know in advance, for example, to offer a sequence of courses in qualitative research, to teach someone how to, quote, do a phenomenology, to teach someone how to analyze data. And I would say that's where a lot of us live right now, is in 2.0. And there's nothing wrong with that. Qualitative 3.0 begins to use postmodern theories to open up concepts associated with qualitative inquiry: validity, voice, data, empathy, authenticity, experience, interviewing, the field itself, reflexivity, clarity. All of those terms are under suspicion in various ways. This work has been stalled for years when qualitative researchers turn to the defense not just of methodology, but also of the various epistemologies it carries on its back: feminist theories, race theories, class theories, postmodern theories, etc. The field continues to be structured in a kind of interpretive mixed methods, there's a phrase for you, enters the picture and begins to be normalized. Qualitative 4 is becoming, in the Deleuzian sense, as researchers who, weary of a decade of defending qualitative research and eager to get on with their own work, again imagine and accomplish an inquiry that might produce different knowledge and produce knowledge differently. This inquiry cannot be tidily described in textbooks or handbooks. There is no methodological instrumentality to be unproblematically learned. In this methodology to come, we begin to do it differently wherever we are in our projects. Here the term post-qualitative begins to make a certain kind of sense. That term is from my colleague Betty St. Pierre down at the University of Germany, Georgia. She may think it's Germany in the present moment, but so the concept of post-qualitative, it is the fleshing out of post-qualitative that is my purpose in this paper. To do this, I will first sketch efforts to discipline qualitative research via standards and rubrics, and I don't want to spend very much time there. That's a kind of discipline and punish part of the paper. I will then call upon various escapes that have already occurred. Finally, I will elaborate what post-qualitative might mean, and especially what it might look like in practice. So, all of this is toward what Deleuze calls, in some ways, 1,000 tiny paradigms, which I think is a very evocative phrase, to figure out how to kind of break the hold of, well, certainly the hold of a qualitative-quantitative binary, and also break the hold of the typical or conventional way to think about the family of qualitative research as interpretive, critical, post, one thing or another, and instead think about a thousand tiny methodologies. All right, so in terms of the discipline and punish section of the paper, I talk about what's happening in political science. I'm always interested in what's happening across disciplinary areas. I think they're informative and instructive when you're trying to figure out what's going on in your own field. And political science traditionally has been very positivist. And they're having their own paradigm wars, or whatever you call them right now. And it's interesting to see how they're going differently. Maybe because the rest of us have already done this. They too had some struggles around quantitative imperialism. And then I call on the National Science Foundation, which has in the United States funds a lot of research, including increasingly qualitative work, as long as it's positivist qualitative work. And they put out templates to help you figure out how to get funded, and they're part of this quantitative imperialism. Then I compare and contrast. The AERA a few years ago fell into this. I mean, they couldn't help themselves. Part of it was, and the rationale, the rationale they used was, if we don't do it to ourselves, somebody's going to do it to us. So there was this big effort to come up with standards. And they started out with standards for empirical research, which are about what you would think. And supposedly these were for journal editors, to help journal editors figure out what to publish and what not to publish. But of course they travel, and dissertation directors start using them. And they started out for empirical research, and they tried to include everything, every possible kind of work you can think of under this. Well, anytime you try to do standards across all those paradigms, you're going to have some pretty big confusions, but they tried. Then a few years later, they came out with a separate set of standards for the more humanities-based qualitative work. Now, those were interesting. I thought, I don't care where I am in the paradigm situation. I want to use those standards. And the comparison across, there they talked about dissonance, discomfort, and reflexivity, blurred boundaries between the humanities and the social sciences, room for evocative imagery and narrative. There is space to what they call depart from the orthodoxies in demands for transparency and direct refusals of both the movement towards structured abstracts. I don't know if you've seen that up here, but there was some move to have these structured abstracts, and neutrality in favor of research that illuminates, critiques, and evaluates. So there's a lot to be learned by comparing and contrasting those two sets of standards. The contest over the science that can provide the evidence for practice and policy pits the recharged positivism of neoliberalism against a qualitative community at risk of assimilation and the reduction of qualitative to an instrumentalism that meets the demands of audit culture. That's my biggest concern in all of this. To refuse this settlement is to push back in the name of an insistence on epistemological and ontological wrestling, and to call out the unthought in how research-based knowledge is conceptualized and produced. So what does it mean to do qualitative research in this particular moment of where on the one hand you've got all these efforts to come up with all these standards and criteria of one sort or another, and then you've got the pushback from folks who want a broader, bigger arena in which to do their work. Then the next section looks at what I call escapes. And here I look at two things. One is a Spencer Foundation report that came out in September of 2009. The Spencer Foundation in the United States is one of the big money, and it's not big money, but it's more money than not, especially for history and some qualitative research. But they put out a report on the preparation of education researchers based on lessons learned from their research training grants. This is a very interesting document. I also work with George Marcus, who's an ethnographer, anthropologist, and his lessons learned from generations of advising students in ethnography. Both demonstrate, I argue, what it means to think about qualitative research after SRE or SBR, whatever you want to call it, scientific-based research, scientific research in education. The movement we had in the United States, I presume there's some version of it here in Canada, to science up our research. And qualitative folks were particularly called to account to kind of get back in the fold and start doing things in a more systematized sort of way. So what it means to think about qualitative research, that's one of the afters of this paper, after SBR, because that was in 2002. There was a big pushback, and I think that this Spencer report actually is the fruits of that pushback. I was absolutely thrilled to read it because, you push back and you push back and you push back and you think nobody's paying any attention. And then you read something like the Spencer report and you go, wow, that decade of pushing back seems to have registered somewhere anyway. So, what does this Spencer report talk about? Key terms are acknowledged as matters of dispute, key terms such as rigor, value neutrality, and objectivity. All of a sudden, they're not just laid on folks who do qualitative research as if there is some kind of consensus about what they are and what they should be. So not the comfortable navigations of the complex intellectual, social, and educational worlds is interrupted by calls to what they call soul searching, as one follows the debates across the educational literature. Grasp of the epistemological underpinnings of warring ideas is endorsed for all. Hotly contested terrain is both acknowledged and used to warrant a call for producing work of sufficient quality to withstand critical scrutiny from many directions. Contextual knowledge is pointed as key across paradigms. Now that's pretty amazing. In short, rather than a narrowly defined methodological rigor like control groups, the report endorses a depth of understanding educational context, sensitivity to issues of social justice is even in there, and epistemological sophistication. Wouldn't that be nice? While context is much reduced to classroom culture and less to macro structures and forces, this document is ripe for analysis of what lies beneath the surface. I could go on, but it is that I want to spend just a minute on here, especially in contrast with the SRE, or the Scientific Research and Education discourse of about 10 years ago. As someone who frequently whines about the focus on SRE and how it has detracted me from my real interest in feminist research methodology, I was quite heartened by the obvious effect of this last 10 years of protest. Frequent references are made to how the tensions between qualitative and quantitative help one think deeply about underlying assumptions. Mindful attendance of some of the more lively and well-attended AERA sessions is evoked, or invoked, I guess would be the word. Even the old chestnut that question determines method is something to be discussed, not assumed, because I saw that as a kind of easy out in a lot of this talk for a while. Oh, let your question determine your method. As if your methodological positionality doesn't have a huge shaping influence on the kind of questions you ask. And research questions are finally seen as evolving. Funny to have to make a big deal out of that, but yes, questions themselves can be emergent and can shift and change over the course of a study. So, for qualitative researchers who felt marginalized by the calls for a common language and unity of purpose, there is a sense of incommensurabilities at work in this document in terms of the struggle over science that has to be taken for what it is. Power struggles over who gets to set the terms of the debate. This is about difference, not sameness, a difference that begins to be acknowledged in this report. Do you folks want to come in and sit closer? There's a lot of room in front here. No? Okay, we're happy. All right. All is not perfect. New positivisms sneak in. And I won't go on about that, but ground has moved. The objectivity debates are now acknowledged, and good educational researchers are to be trained to be reflexive and have well thought out positions in the face of these debates. Qualitative research now has, quote, families. Yeah, even that's a step right there, because for a long time it was you had your quantitative and then you had your qualitative. It was all some one thing. Qualitative research now has families with different approaches and debates around skills-based versus theory-based training. The sort of quantitative imperialism that the political science folks are pushing back on pretty good has been shaken. And most encouragingly, seemingly from within the task force itself, the task force that wrote this report, the disciplining of qualitative research appears to be abated. Rather than more standards, the tables are turned toward the importance of epistemological grounding across paradigms. Dare I say, the address actually seems more to positivism than previous efforts to foster a sort of positivist qualitative research. While the disappearance of less mainstream qualitative research continues, there's no mention of autoethnography, performance ethnography, or even critical ethnography, which I think was a big surprise for me, because that's alive and well for quite some time now. It appears there's room at the table for qualitative research as long as it behaves itself. To the extent the Spencer Report registers stresses and controversies, I announce no great remaking of old divides. Much work remains to be done, particularly, I would say, on the front of new methodology for new times. Here's where I think the George Marcus lessons learned from his decades of working with doctoral students in anthropology becomes useful. He's interested in a kind of research training that embraces messy conceptual labor. What would that kind of research training look like? Embraces messy conceptual labor, develops meta-methodological habits and an ecology of movement from within situated inquiry, begins to ask questions like, when is data? So this whole, even data itself becomes a sort of when question. Devising ways to blend micro and macro in the face of complex objects constituted in systems of networked agencies. So we rethink what our objects of inquiry are and where they come from and how they get constituted in these networks systems of networked agencies. Theorizing methodologies of engagement in what some have called the post-theory moment and some have called the ruins of advocacy. I mean, it used to be enough to be an advocate, but now your advocacy is under suspicion. I would say ever since Foucault, you know, nothing is innocent, everything's dangerous. That those of us who see ourselves as what Foucault called the great liberators, the masters of truth and justice, have to ask ourselves some pretty hard questions about who it is we think we're liberating. All right, so George Marcus brings all this up within the context of advising doctoral students. In order to break the hold of Cartesian foundations on the research imagination, sometimes I think we are caught between two regimes of truth. On the one hand, you have the kind of SRE, SBR, neo-positivism, conservative qualitative research that's alive and well. And then on the other hand, you have all this talk of the new and the neo-new or whatever, and experiments. The anthropologists have written a book called The Experimental Moment in the Human Sciences, where there's a great profusion of ways of going about this work that break free of the constraints of traditional science. Logics have begun to shift. What does it mean to move beyond the limits of the kinds of change that can be produced within current paradigms? At the same time, we're crushed by demands for more evidence-based research under some gold standard. Of course, as many have argued for quite some time, the key is to contest what counts as science. That's why that actually propelled my work for about a decade in fighting this SBR, SRE stuff. It became clear to me that you had to go after science. Science itself had to be redefined, enlarged. Pressure had to be put on that concept so that narrow. I ended up spending a fair amount of time distinguishing between science and scientism, which I think is a very helpful distinction, so that a lot of this really narrow stuff is actually scientism. And that's not a compliment. So then the paper moves into this concept of the post-qualitative, which is to explore this space, I call on three exemplars, and that's what I do. I sometimes call myself a narrator of methodology. I am sort of always cruising for research studies that incite my interest in one thing or another, and then I narrate their methodology. Now, I was trained in literary criticism, so maybe that's where it comes from. Instead of looking at novels, I look at research examples, and then I narrate those methodologies. So for the purposes of this paper, I looked at three. From Sweden, a focus on relational entangled data analysis in the feminist classroom. From Australia, a collaborative study of the intersection of Western and Aboriginal knowledge systems. And from Egypt, a feminist post-colonial study of the women's mosque movement, which is, I don't know if you noticed, when Egypt had its moment there in the democratic sun, there were a lot of women in the streets. And when you look at a lot of the other countries from that part of the world, there's not a lot of women in the streets. So I found myself saying, what are all those women doing in the streets? And this article kind of helped me begin to understand that. So, to Sweden. In an essay on thinking as sexed and collaborative analysis as feminist, Swedish feminist post-structuralist Hilavi Lenz Taguchi theorizes Deleuze and Guattari's molecular girl as an embodied becoming against a metaphysics of an individual subject and mind. Looking at 10 doctoral students engaged in collaborative deconstructive analysis of qualitative data, displacing and unhinging their own thinking was where they started. Now that's an interesting place to start in your data analysis, how to unhinge your own thinking. Trying to resist habitual ways of reading data, what Deleuze termed the violence of thinking was embraced as lines of flight were actualized in computer designs for analysis and writing. Page work, colors, lines, graphemes, commentary boxes all mark the various deconstructive moves in ways that went well beyond coding and categorizing, which is sort of 101 analysis of qualitative data, in identifying dominant and resistant discourses at work and escaping binaries into continuums and multiplicities. New events of thinking were materialized, data could be relived from differing subject positions, thinking became creation as researchers were transformed into creative thinkers in assemblage with one another as a state of virtuality. Here, being used by thought had its pleasures, zigzagging through networks of difference in a non-hierarchical manner. Now, that's not usually how we think about data analysis, but framing theories of subjectivity within intra-actional, post-human, relational entanglements, the essay elaborates a diffractive reading that goes beyond performativity as a difference-driven analytic. And this concept of diffractive is something I'm seeing in the, if you think of a fractal, and you got light coming out from all these various directions, I mean, multiple directions, diffractive reading. With thanks to Madonna, Molecular Girl enacts a gendered kind of collaborative analysis that is at the limits of not just philosophy, but also feminism. A becoming woman as the woman who thinks in a way that needs others in order to displace and unhinge one's own understandings, beyond habit via embodied and enabling violences. This is something other than negation, something Deleuzian in using positive and affirmative difference as both continuum and multiplicity. Data get lived in new ways. That's a nice sentence. Data get lived in new ways. And so we move into pleasure and surprise in engaging with theory to displace the terror that too often characterizes women's experiences with theory in trying to analyze data. Companionship becomes the dominant state as one opens up to being used by thought, making love to one's data. You don't usually see phrases like that. Making love to one's data becomes thinkable as a kind of ethics, something quite different from better or smarter, something more akin to the in-between places of pleasure and pain, struggling with and against, becoming more and other in a field of production of desire that is way beyond interpretation. So I try to abstract out a couple of, lessons learned or whatever from this, and I say, well, one of the things then about post-qualitative analysis looks like, there are other, quote, quote, other analytic practices at work here, quite other to the cutting and pasting of coding. What the essay describes in the process of design is what Adrian Rifkin terms a topographical analysis that uses bits and pieces of theory to listen to the dynamics attuned to what he calls figural densities of text set alongside one another. This allows for patterns of not meaning, but of configurations that open up to unexpected readings of and listenings to materials in what might be termed fractal analysis. Here, a new kind of object comes to attention, an object pulled out of shape by its framing, and equally importantly, framings pulled out of shape by its object. I guess that's a kind of reciprocity, that both the framer and the framed are pulled out of shape by one another. This challenges who you think you are in a way that holds promise for advancing the critical edge of our practice. So that's one, whatever this post-qualitative thing is, it's got these other analytic practices at work. A second is that there's other researcher subjectivities at play here. After affect, A-F-F-E-C-T, affect theory might provide some direction, as it is in Lauren Berlant's wonderful new book called Cruel Optimism. She says that affect theory can help us trouble the liberal culture of true feeling that is so sentimentally present in much of the qualitative research about what Ruth Behar called the vulnerable ethnographer, which kind of had its moment, but now it's, I always call that work leaky. It's very leaky. And then autoethnography, which can also be leaky. To interrupt the drama of the self, Berlant articulates a Raymond Williams structure of feeling that is refracted in shared historical time, bespeaking what she calls a shared nervous system in this time of surviving neoliberalism. Berlant terms this a desubjective queerness. That's a phrase to kind of think about too. Desubjective queerness that is not so much internal self-involvement mired in narcissism as a sort of counter-affect that works against what she calls the inflated poetic interiority of a liberal investment in emotional authenticity, what Berlant terms the demand for a feeling fix that is a kind of, quote, noisy affectivity. And I remember when I did the Angels book, one of the questions I was so surprised at that kept coming up again and again was whether I cried. And I tried to figure out, well, what's that got to do with the price of tea in China? Did you cry? And then I came to realize that it had something to do with ethics, and it also had something to do with validity. It's sort of like if I didn't cry, I hadn't done ethical research, and I hadn't done valid research. So that was a kind of way into, I wrote a paper called The Validity of Tears. Berlant's interest, as is mine, is in a post-spectacular dramatized story, de-dramatized story, a deflationary aesthetic that points to the insecurity of knowing, calling on Agamben, the Italian theorist Agamben's inoperative community. This is a non-relation that performs the stuck places and the limits of what feelings can do, working out of a fatigue with affective inflation and resulting intensities. Berlant's counter-affect positions feeling as just one nodal point among many and not the most important. The rescuing researcher is displaced in the transition from less heroic practices to a place where what she calls a brush with solidarity, that might be the best we can hope for, in the present, what she calls bruising affect sphere, and I love this phrase, of what is already not working. You think about what is already not working, and how do we do our work in that space? So that was the second point of post-qualitative work, is this idea of a different kind of researcher subjectivity that asks hard questions about the affect, feeling, emotions, and thirdly, an other theory of change. A third aspect of post-qualitative work is another theory of change. In Foucault Beyond Foucault, Jeffrey Nealon lauds the profound Nietzscheanism that Deleuze reads in Foucault and articulates a theory of change that is imminent rather than vanguard and practice-based accretions rather than the big bang of some new paradigm. Nealon tracks the slow mutations, accretions, and accumulations that occur at a low level of visibility, therefore evoking little resistance as they remake through a network of mutual determinations. His example is the cell phone and how it works from within the mutation of forces and practices out of a multiplicity of minor processes of different origins and scattered locations to overlap, repeat, and imitate, gradually producing a blueprint. So what might the blueprint for post-qualitative look like? Through a convergence of practices of intensity and emergence, both practices and objects of a field are redefined and reconfigured. What is key for Foucault is that practice itself is the motor and mode of change. Rather than the oppositions of humanism, Foucault's resistance is about power and the body as they are enacted, intensifications turned on themselves, what someone has called a jujitsu spread across a wild field and its contacts with power. To explore what this might look like, I call upon a not yet published book called Water in a Dry Land by Margaret Somerville in press with Routledge's innovative ethnography series. This is a story of water and writing that longs to be water, a searching of water in a dry land, rain that never and then finally comes. It encompasses environmental limits, decades of global mobilization, and indigenous stories and ceremonies as resources to link language, landscape, and cultures towards living in balance with nature. A 5-year collaborative autoethnographic study of drought in Australia by a team of indigenous and non-indigenous researchers. It has planetary implications for resource management and embodied arts-based methodology across cultural differences. Containing important web links to the visual elements of the project, it elaborates place pedagogy, practices of everyday life, a literature review of water, sharp-tongued women, elusive lakes, racial violence, and moving between Western and Aboriginal knowledge systems. Touching upon deep mapping and sacred waters, it is a unique and strong voice book in its elaboration of art and place as public pedagogy. It generates a radical alternative methodology across worlds that cannot know one another, what she calls a methodology of lemons, and I never was exactly sure what the word, of entanglement and reflexivity out of body work, artwork, and stories were produced, journals, photos, and interviews were collected, emerging relationships, conversations, images, and ideas were documented. They were then shaped into a series of public exhibitions of artwork and text. Such an exemplar is in excess of intersectionality in its attention to multidirectionalities, post-human bodies, intra-actional networks, contingency, non-mastery, and incalculables. It takes on issues of messy conceptual labor. Here I'm using that George Marcus stuff to look at it. Difference, otherness, and disparity, and incompleteness as a positive norm. That's an interesting phrase. Incompleteness as a positive norm. It works the stuck places where critical ideas have become their own orthodoxy. It moves towards glimmers of alternative understandings and practices that give coherence and imaginary to whatever post-qualitative might mean. This is what Jacques Rancière calls a redistribution of the sensible versus policing, a change in common sense to the order of things that has much to do with the politics of a science of indeterminacy, what Judith Butler terms a brave inadequacy versus a masterful humanist subject. Such a subject acknowledges the limits of transparency and reflexivity as it works the self as not a sign of virtue. Here we live the ethical resistance to mastery toward a new kind of authority where the mess is the message. I love that phrase. The mess is the message. Trained in the ruins of empire, what becomes possible in terms of an engaged social science in such a place? An example of feminist work in post-colonial situations enfleshes such ideas of moving beyond critical orthodoxies in the ruins of empire. This is the study of Egyptian women's mosque movement that I referred to earlier and is my last example here. It puts under pressure the secular liberal politics of feminism. I read this in my feminist reading group, and so there we were, a bunch of Western women who think we're so feminist, and we were reading this example that put under pressure our own liberal politics. Powerfully using ethnographic data, what she terms this visceral register to rethink agency, the normative subject of feminist theory, and the ideology of emancipation that underwrites feminism, Mahmoud troubles Western ideas of piety, reserve, restraint, and modesty in order to understand desire as shaped by non-liberal traditions. Willing to unsettle her own views, Mahmoud departs not from a position of certainty, but one of risk to one's own sense of political engagement. Mahmoud's very situated inquiry undergirds my suspicion of efforts to codify and discipline the beyond of qualitative work. I think we have to be careful not to come in with our own standards and criteria. and ask instead, how might we move from what needs to be opposed to what can be imagined out of what is already happening? To conclude, dominant ideas of qualitative research assume a modernist self, transparent methods, and reflexivity as a too easy solution to whatever problems might arise. While the illusion of neat and tidy research has long been troubled, methodological examination tends to set up either-or dynamics in terms of old school and what comes next sort of practices. Yet in the complex ecology of qualitative research in the present moment, the task is to move beyond the capture of a narrow scientism, where qualitative research is reduced to an instrumentalism that meets the demands of audit culture, in inventing practices that do not yet exist. And this is what I encourage all my students to do, is try to figure out where in your work can you invent a practice that doesn't yet exist. Every field is heavily fractured and contested around such issues these days. Deep critical rumblings abound, with political science perhaps the hottest these days. Shared standards and others such as assimilating moves appear to have peaked and maybe even blinked in the face of resistance from post-foundational advocates. Talk of post-neoliberalism, which I Googled one day just to see, and it exists. And there's even a post-neoliberalism. Talk of post-neoliberalism is beginning to be heard in some corners of South America and U.S. art speak, including Canada. A bunch of artists and researchers got together at Banff last summer and explored some of these issues. Evidence-based practice seems to be sputtering on its own failures to produce. And I, of course, read the educational literature quite a bit, and like the What Works Clearinghouse is in some trouble. They can't find anything that works according to their specifications. They've spent, I don't know how many millions of dollars looking for studies that fit their ideas of rigor that then produce knowledge about what works so that it can be, what do they call it, scaled up, which of course doesn't work, given the importance of context. So evidence-based practice seems to be sputtering on its own failure to produce. Even Bill Gates is newly enamored of stories, according to Newsweek from not too long ago. On the other hand, while counter movements abound, the National Science Foundation continues to spend millions a year on the importance of hypothetical deductive research. The age of big data and the march of quantification are not going away. But the ascendance of reflexive knowledge is an even more general pattern, and even metric mania is up against its limits as our love affair with numbers is beginning to run its course in the public imaginary. My last paragraph. Structured by relations of difference and ontological troubles across a variety of angles and different registers, we imagine forward out of troubling a scientificity, which is Foucault's word, again, that claims that objectivity, to trouble a scientificity that claims that objectivity is not political, empiricism is not interpretive, chance can be tamed via mathematization, and progress equals greater governmentality. In my reading of the tea leaves, what appears to be amassing is a widespread recognition that to do less than a kind of performing forward, an enactment of the after neoliberalism, is to court not just a narrowed science, but a narrowed future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patti. When we planned this program, we wanted to make sure that we had plenty of time for a dialogue with Patti. So we have about an hour to engage Patti more deeply about her remarks, or for you to engage with some of the queries that you have in terms of your research, the politics that you're working on. So we have a mic right in the middle. So if folks don't mind lining up, introduce yourself, and then provide a brief question/commentary, that would be terrific.
You get the first question.
I'm glad you raised the issue around political science. You know, I think what's I'm experiencing here in Ontario is this growing kind of desire for the Ministry of Education, and there might be people here from that ministry, that require an evidence-based approach to research in order to legitimize public spending
Yes.
in an area.
Yes.
And it's a challenge, particularly because we have a fairly strong social policy agenda here, but that whole kind of influence around a more conservative approach has taken hold, and it's hard to make a shift. So I'm just wondering, you know, if you can share some ideas.
Well, I've always thought that the best, what do they say, the best defense is an offense. And one thing you have to go after is all the policies that have no evidence. I mean, this idea that we're only going to give you money if you have evidence-based arguments, see if you can come back and say, well, how come we give all this money to this, 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 and this, and it has no evidence. That's just one possible strategy. The other thing is, what is evidence? Contest at that place. Who gets to say what evidence is? You know, and the Brits have been on this bus longer than most of us have been, and they're at a place, they start fighting back sooner. So there's a whole body of literature coming out of the UK on fight back, and I would say it's particularly coming out of medicine, on fight back against these demands and to show how it's sort of inoperable and unevenly applied they are.
And medicine is also interesting because there you're evaluated based on your practice, and in education we're evaluated based on our outcomes.
Oh,
And
yes.
it's quite problematic. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
That's a good distinction.
Yes, you betcha, yeah. Well, you know, teachers aren't as powerful as doctors are they? So let's go after let's blame the teachers for the collapse of the banks.
Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Ellie Perkins, and I teach at the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University here in Toronto. I wanted to ask you to comment a little bit about the role of progressive research, or of our responsibilities as researchers for generating this alternative vision, imaginary of the future. And I'm asking, as a climate change researcher, and someone who I've been engaging with this idea of how do we take advantage of this moment, which challenges us to recognize commons that are all around us, that have been here for ages, that we have allowed to become partitioned off and divided up and, you know, positivized. And we have a moment now when it's important for us to think about how, from the grassroots, at the local level, we create means of managing those commons that can become global. So I see research as having a crucial role in this. And I'd like to hear your comments about how we can have the courage and network and communicate and do this better.
Thank you. You're in of course, terribly important area right now. I mean, I think you know part of the answer is participatory. That whatever it means to do participatory research and participatory action research, and wherever that's going these days, and whatever ethics and politics get called up in the effort to do that kind of work that have to be wrestled with. There was a very good edited collection that just came out of UBC. Can you give me my paper?
Yep.
That it's because it's edited, it's got all kinds of different people involved, but it was, unlike a lot of edited collections, it was pretty consistently interesting. Oh, now I see my paper's not finished, and I see my bibliography particularly is not finished. I think it was Cream was her name. Crease. C-R-E-E-S-E, and Frisbee came out in 12 from UBC Press on participatory, community-based research from a feminist angle, working across all kinds of populations, around all kinds of projects. And I think that in ecological work particularly, I mean, I remember as feminist methodology people in the early years of all that, you had to make decisions about how big you thought you might be versus how little you thought you might be. And I know there was a lot of feminist decision making about going little. Like, let's research our own teaching, for example. Instead of thinking we're going to go in and be the great liberator, we're going to research our own teaching and we're going to try to do something at a local level around participatory action research and not go too big too fast. I mean, I think on the other hand, we want to have big, I mean, we'd like to have an effect on climate change. But sometimes I think by going too big too fast, we miss the chances we have of a smaller effect in the local. And participatory action research is made for that because it is reciprocally educative. Mm-hmm. The idea is that everybody gets smarter by participating in the work.
Right. I really liked what you said about resisting the idea that things can be scaled up, that scaling up is an option. Mm-hmm. And it reminds me of what Elinor Ostrom said about, in her book, Governing the Commons, which is that it's not at all guaranteed that people can develop mechanisms for limiting entry, so it's not an open access situation, but it's a controlled situation where the community does have control over what's happening. And in certain circumstances, she said, based on all of her research, which I'm sure you would have a field day with some of her methods, but anyway, that was it. That was then, this is now. She said in some particular local circumstances, it's possible for people to create those institutions. Yeah. It's not at all guaranteed that it happens, but it only happens at the local level.
It only happens at the local level.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Ramona Gananathan. I'm one of the PhD students here in HDAP, which is a very positivist kind of department at
Name
OISE.
the department again?
Human Development, Applied Psycho. There's some funky new name now. But anyway, my question is, I've really been intrigued by what you've said today, and I'm curious about how you would approach a mixed method study if you were to sort of stay true to some of the principles you've talked about today.
Well, let me say a few words about the discipline of psychology first. There's an increasing literature on qualitative research in psychology, and even textbooks on teaching qualitative work in that discipline. So it's not like it's untouched by qualitative work. It's having its own version of, well, we could call them the paradigm wars if you wanted to, but paradigm discussions. So you have to remind me what your question was.
Mixed methods research.
Mixed
like, how would you stay true to the principles while trying to engage in mixed methods?
Give it up.
Give it up.
What
Can
you're
you call
doing,
my supervisor?
Yvonne Lincoln used to say, you can't mix paradigms. You will have a paradigm breakdown. You will have, I think she called it paradigmatic schizophrenia. If you try to combine the ideas that the world is round with the idea that the world is flat, which is what you're doing if you're going across paradigms. There are incommensurabilities at work in paradigms that I think can be very fertile. And if you can embrace those incommensurables and embrace how they interrupt one another and how they give us different angles on things, not necessarily around consensus or even convergence, but in fact, sometimes radically different findings. And what does it mean to layer those radically different findings in a way that interrupt your findings? So I think what you do is end up getting closer to the complications of the lived world instead of having a reductionist picture, which is, I think, what we get sometimes with across the paradigms. You end up with this too tidy, too simple angle on things. And again, mixed methods is a fertile situation for moving into this more complicated space. So do complicated mixed methods. Embrace the incommensurables.
Okay, thank you.
While someone else is going up there, let me just say a minute about political science. There is a literature called perestroika around poli-sci that is absolutely fascinating. And this was, they tell us, there's a book called Perestroika, and it's on how, kind of the method wars in political science. And it's about how basically a group of graduate students had to be anonymous. They had an anonymous movement to bring qualitative methods to their field because they were afraid if they came out of the closet as qualitative researchers, they'd never get a job. So they came up with this whole narrative. It's just really fun to read. And they started organizing at conferences, and they made up somebody to be their leader, and then they had this whole thing. So anyway, this perestroika would be the place. You can Google it. If you Google perestroika, all this will come up. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Joan Eakin, and I'm actually the director of the Center for Critical Qualitative Health Research.
We love it.
It's such a treat to come over here where, I mean, I've come from the School of Public Health here in the Faculty of Medicine, and it's the land of where the apex of methodology is the randomized clinical trial. So you can imagine the kinds of challenges that qualitative research encounters in that context. But I've taught methodology for years in the health research field. And one thing that I observe, which feels differently over here in education, is there it's almost all entirely women, and who are drawn into the qualitative methodologies. And I wondered if you had any comment. Obviously, I'm sure you do, but looking at the sorts of things that you're telling us about that are coming down the pipe that we need to think about and so on, has the fact that certainly in health, it seems to be something that somehow speaks or women can speak to more than men. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Let me ask you a question first. Are you hooked up with the critical qualitative, or not the critical, but the qualitative health folks in Alberta?
Well, I don't know what you call hooked up.
Well, you know about them and they know about you.
Funny, I'm actually giving a plenary at their conference in Montreal next week on issues of the standardization, and we're trying to put to rest the criteria, the checklist for adjudicating papers in publishing.
Wonderful.
So that doesn't say what I think about the Alberta group, but our group is particularly the critical in our name is not coincidental. It's explicitly trying to distinguish a particular kind of thinking in this field.
All right, so the gender politics of qualitative research, especially in terms of who takes the courses, was that your original question?
Yeah, who's practicing it? Because who's taking the courses, in fact, are the people
and then
who
goes
are
on to do it? Well, yes, I think education is a little bit different, but not that much. Most of my students are female, but you know, most of the doctoral students in the College of Education are female too. So I think you have to look at the larger pool. And then you have to ask, how come so many women are going on for graduate degrees? Where are the men to a certain extent? And where are they? They're in, like in the College of Education, there's some places, there's a lot in social studies, for example. But there's not very many in literacy. So there's a gender politics to who goes where, why. And then in terms of methodology, they end up in either qual or quant, based on, I don't know if anybody's ever looked into the based on why. In nursing, in your field, I would think you just have such a female population, right?
Well, I'm not in nursing, but that's true in many health professions and people doing research in the health professions. But, and of course, increasingly, medicine is now women as well.
Sure.
But even within that, it strikes me that it's not just the gender, the distribution of, the gender distribution of people in various professions. It's more than that. I somehow feel it's about women's ways of thinking or interest or feeling. I don't quite know, but it's more profound than
former
just.
Student of mine named Jim Sherrick wrote a piece called Coloring Epistemologies, which explores this question a bit within the context of race. How come students of color gravitate towards qualitative? Not exclusively by any means. And he talks about epistemological clothing that fits better as part of that reason. And I think you could say the same thing in the case of gender. So,
Thank you. Thank you very much.
yeah. Chloe's gonna ask a question.
Hi, Patty.
Hi, Chloe.
Thank you for your talk. It's nice to see you. I was curious about how much you mentioned throughout your talk in different ways this idea of training, like the training of methodologists and the teaching of methodologies. And I was also struck by your comment that you ask your students to always do something new that's never been done before. And yeah, and I was thinking about how the way we teach methodology is something, in fact, that can't be experimented with, has a lot to do with this idea that trying new things might be dangerous. And I think the way we talk about that danger is ethics, but I'm not sure that ethics really captures. So I'm curious about that, like how you think about teaching methodology and encouraging that kind of experimentation and what the risks of that are and how you think about ethics in the context of that kind of teaching.
Yes, well, thank you, Chloe. The ethics of the new, and especially the ethics of encouraging students to experiment with the new and what that means in their lives, I make mine do pretty conventional stuff. And then I tell them, once they show me they can do that, then they can experiment. They don't have to, but they can. And some of them do and some of them don't. And I also try to make experimentation doable. Like I talk about little things, it doesn't have to be some big revolutionary whatever. But like if you just figure out within the context of your situated inquiry, where's some space you can wiggle around a little bit and maybe come up with a different way to think about X, whether it be something we usually don't think about as an experiment, like when I said, when is data? I mean, that's such a fresh way to think about data. And so it doesn't have to be this huge revolutionary thing. And I think we have to be careful to produce students who can do the conventional. I know there's a politic to that, and it keeps us sort of corralled back. And actually, Betty St. Pierre and I go around and around and around on this, because she just wants to let them loose. She thinks more new will come out if we let them loose, and I suppose that's true to a certain extent. But are they going to be able to are they going to be the PhD with the JOB? Because I think at a certain point, that's got to be part of our ethics of teaching. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Ping Chen Xiong. I'm a sociologist. I've taught qualitative research for quite some time. And today I'm really impressed by the way that you laid out your overall structure. You start out by talking about the development of qualitative approaches based upon very much maybe the US throughout chronology. And then when you talk about afterwards, you use 3 examples. And all the examples are not from the US.
That is true.
Yes. And so I have been thinking about the notion of a globalized qualitative research. And I see 2 counter discourses against the Anglo-American domination in qualitative research. And one is the Aboriginal decolonizing qualitative research centered around operational scholars. And the other is from the peripheral countries. And the peripheral countries, basically, I think there a lot of work needs to be done. And I'd like to hear you talk more about how to shift this sort of divide between the Anglo-American court and the peripheral and the counter-discourse. Basically, we've seen people continue saying that, well, the peripheral has nothing to contribute. We don't know what kind of epistemology that they could contribute. What we have done, we meaning the court, has done is that we learn how to do it so that we don't other the periphery. And unless you could prove that you have something interesting to say at the global platforms, we don't know what we can learn from you. And what I like you put out is that to actually see that the peripheral could be knowledge producer rather than only knowledge consumers, that consuming what has been produced from the core. So I would really like to hear more from you about this related issues.
Well, it sounds like the work is already happening. It just needs to be brought into visibility. And that means editors maybe editing collections from around the peripheries to bring them into greater visibility, which is kind of what that participatory research book I talked about did, because it was whatever British Columbia is, this went way out into the edges of British Columbia in terms of the work that they were featuring. So to have a certain consciousness, I guess, about not just reproducing the center in whatever it is you're doing. Teaming up, I know Alison Jones's work with Maori researchers in New Zealand is just out of this world. And she makes a point of, in whatever she's doing, she teams up with a Maori scholar. And then she kind of knows the publishing world, so she can help bring, again, it's about bringing work that's already happening into visibility. There's a book called Asia as Method,
Yes.
which I've just discovered.
Yes. It's
So
a
then,
wonderful
that's
book.
part of my point.
Yeah.
There's stuff that's already happening and has been happening for a long time. And it has been contesting the center. And reading that made me, you knew that, right? Yeah. I wrote to Roland, I said, oh, I'm so excited. And he said, look at my dissertation. You will notice that I used it in there. So sometimes things can be brought to the center's attention and the center doesn't even see them. So whatever it means to keep coming, for people like Roland to keep coming back at me with that kind of stuff. So I think those are pretty unsatisfactory sorts of answers, but.
Yeah, thank you.
So my question is, Patti, looking at, when I was a PhD student and I took Tara's course, one of the articles we read was Open Ideological Research. I think it was written by you. And it was very impressive for me because I was nourished in ideologies. And I believed strongly about justice and so on. So the question that listening to your presentation today about post-qualitative, post-positivist, post-structuralist, I wonder what has happened to that idea of openly ideological research.
To this idea of what?
Openly ideological research.
Openly ideological. That was in my Marxist phase.
Okay. So just let me push further. Let me just ask a question.
80s. Yeah, right.
So my question is therefore as follows. If now, you referred to Sabah Mahmood and a few others also, and there was a question about the non-Western epistemologies and so on. So if social justice is subjective, contextual, and multiple and plural, and so are ideologies, where does this lead us to in terms of not just wars of ideologies and paradigms, but does it have implications for wars in other sense that are destructive?
Wars, in other sense?
Yeah.
Well, I would like to think that yes, how we think and how we rethink and how we unthink will have. I mean, that's the it has a politics, and that politics at the local level can have some trickle up. I don't know what you want to call it, but I've been reading a lot of Jacques Rancière, who talks about how we have to, whatever it means to try to change the common sense of a culture. And he too talks about this idea of little things, which a long time ago, a friend and I used to call the cockroach theory of social change. That instead of thinking about big bangs and revolutions that are going to change everything, you know, overnight or whatever, that we think more in the sense of these small, local, having faith that other people are doing small, local too, and that they'll have some accretions and aggregations. It's sort of an aggregative theory of social change, that those sorts of changes can happen in ways that will then start affecting the bigger, I don't know, foreign policy I think you're talking about.
Thank you.
I want to hear just one comment about perestroika, I guess you said?
Perestroika.
Right.
Yeah.
I can just tell you it was not fun in real.
It was not what?
Fun.
Oh, in the real, it was not fun.
Not at all.
Nerve-wracking.
Not at all, okay? So sometimes, as you say, the paradigm, which is like in the mind, is simplifying too much the reality, right? So that's exactly an example.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Patti, thank you for an inspiring talk again. I was very happily surprised that you mentioned that you have been reading exemplaries, and one of them was Politics of Piety by Mahmoud. But I was thinking of you describing yourself as a liberal feminist, basically reading that text, and wondering if you had any critiques of that ethnography, specifically on the author's positionality, where the way I read it was she came into the mosques of Egypt working with women inside, and have not at all helped the readers understand where she came from, how she did the work, where was she standing.
Not enough of her own positionality.
Right. And at the same time, taking that kind of work, I think it's an important piece of work, but taking it out of the context of the work of decades of Arab Muslim feminists. And it's not even framed or even close to addressing that kind of work theoretically and methodologically has been happening for decades.
So if one wanted to educate oneself about that stuff, that's not going to help you. In a way, you're talking about the review of the literature that she builds into her launching off situation. I would have to agree with you on that.
Okay.
I don't know. She didn't say enough.
No.
She didn't say enough about herself to even know kind of where she came from. She was clearly an outsider, which I usually don't have any problems with. I mean, I think there's insider research and there's outsider research, but each one sets up a different sort of set of responsibilities.
And then you could tell from her last name that she is quote-unquote Muslim.
Got something Muslim going on there with that name, yeah.
But at the same time, having that kind of access into the mosques is, to me, needs to be questioned and addressed more thoroughly and more ethically, so that we know where that analysis came from also.
I don't have any problems with what you're saying. It wasn't in there, and all I can say just off the top of my head is it was kind of a relief in a way. I mean, I get so tired sometimes of all the, I guess you could call it the autoethnographic parts of things. It's like I want to hear about those women. I was mostly interested in those women, and I didn't want to hear too much about her. I would have taken a little bit more, but not too much. So I thought, I kind of, in an odd way, felt if she's going to sin on the side of not telling me about herself instead of telling me too much about herself. That's just my bias right now.
Hi.
Yes, ma'am.
Thanks very much for your talk. I teach about environmental and ecosystem health here at OISE UT. I teach graduate students, and my course is called Environmental Health, Transformative Higher Education and Policy Change, Education for Social and Ecosystem Healing. So it's a very busy, what you're going to do about it course. And I wanted to just thank you for your comments on evidence-based medicine and science, because in environmental health, we talk about the precautionary principle, which means acting in the face of scientific uncertainty. And in fact, the original, in your country, the Surgeon General went on a limb and declared that there should be no smoking in public places long before the exact carcinogen, benzoapyrene, was discovered that was causing lung cancer. There are many now, we know, but the fact was they made a decision based on what's called weight of evidence. And that is very, very important in environmental medicine, which is terminology that's used. The basis of our pesticide bylaws in this province, in this country, in this city, were based on that kind of precautionary principle. We may not have all the exact particular chemicals and whatever, but what we can see is weight of evidence, and we have to do policy making on those kinds of decisions. So I just wanted to throw that out because it's quite legitimate in environmental medicine to talk about the precautionary principle. It's international. It's IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer. So it's not just like up in the airy-fairy stuff. It's quite real.
Thank you. I wanted to mention one more thing that happened at OSU just before I left, so I wasn't able to get it into the paper. There was a woman named Elizabeth Povinelli who came to campus. She gave a talk that knocked my head off. It was just last Friday. So I'm still kind of reeling from it, but she's a white woman who worked with Aboriginals folks in the northwest part of Australia. And she was working with them around this arts-based, not unlike the water, eco-water example I talked about. And but she had some things going on that were just amazing in terms of claiming. It was such an example of collaborative work across cultural incommensurables that resulted in a kind of practice that fed that community, which was under great duress. So I guess, with neoliberalism in Australia, they're trying to take resources away from, they've moved from a politics of recognition to where Aboriginal identity means anything, and then in terms of getting resources to they're taking those away now. So she's trying to figure out how to work with these folks so that they can get the resources they need. It's very praxis-oriented, but it's very much around, I'm not a very spiritual person, so I'm usually pretty suspicious of that kind of stuff. But she really was talking about the kind of epistemologies of Aboriginal thinking that went way beyond the dreaming. That dreaming stuff ends up seeming pretty old, because she's talking about videos and, I don't even know, some kind of technology stuff, data, coding, mining, words I didn't even know what they meant, but she's at a very advanced level with the technology, and she's working with these folks around that kind of stuff. And then she's trying to abstract a certain kind of epistemology out of it. So it's just really hot and interesting stuff that I still have to integrate into my own thinking. So I've ordered her books. That's as far as I've gotten with it. But I just wanted to share her name with you in case that kind of stuff interests you. All right, thank you.
We have a wonderful reception, so please stick around and join us with some beverage and some snacks. And on behalf of Tara, myself, and CQERC and the sponsors, we would like to present Patti Lather a small bouquet of flowers as a thank you and to appreciate her time with us. So thank you, everyone, and have a good night.